tremendous pleasure to introduce Ezster Hargittai this morning. I'm known to all of you, but of course she's at Northwestern. She's a fellow of the Berkman Institute and very well known to you all for work on web use.
Well, thanks for coming out. I will be talking about some work that I've been doing recently that relates to explaining why some people are more engaged than others, or how we explain who's really engaged in some online activities, especially related to Web 2.0 types of technologies. So as I think you know, there's a lot of enthusiasm around all that the web has to offer in terms of democratizing the public sphere and getting different voices out there. But we know relatively little in terms of the extent to which that's actually happening and to what extent the voices that we're seeing out there are really more democratic and more representative than prior times. And I guess I shouldn't oversell the presentation. There are certainly limits to what I can do with the data that I have available, but the idea is to start looking at whose voices are we really seeing, who are the people who are contributing. So basically the question is there a participation gap when it comes to online content? And I'll start by discussing why we should care in the first place. I will say that I think this is a group more like most I speak to that I think will understand a lot of the underlying issues. I'll still cover them just in case people have different interests, but I suspect this is a fairly sympathetic group to a lot of the topics here. But so we certainly know already from traditional literature on, say, arts participation and also what gets published, say, in newspapers and opinion pages that voices that are represented and who participates in different activities is not completely uniformly spread across the population. And previous work has certainly found that user background, or not user in this case, but participant background predicts who's more likely to do various things. So the question is, okay, so what would be different now? Why do we need to revisit this question? And well, this is the part that I don't really think I need to explain to this crowd, but obviously, so there's just huge potentials to share content that weren't really there before, and as long as we're able to control for access to digital resources, the barriers to entry are much lower than they were before. So that's the basic premise. I thought I'd take a moment to talk about the overall framework of my work over the years. Pretty much most of the projects that I've looked at approach the questions of internet usage from this perspective. And so the idea is that some of my work has looked at and continues to look at non-users, but a lot of my work is especially interested in users rather than the traditional digital divide of differences between non-users versus users. I'm really interested in differences among people who've already gone online. And again, I think there are enough social scientists in the room that I don't really have to argue this point too much, but that it would matter what socioeconomic background someone has in terms of how they use the internet. But in addition to that, also that their context of use will matter, both technical and social. So on the one hand, what types of technical resources you have will presumably matter in terms of how you use the internet and the extent to which you can participate. But also the social resources you have available would matter. So people in your networks, can you turn to folks for help? Are you hanging out with people who discuss things that you can learn from and pick up ideas from that you can later implement in your own usage? So the idea that both technical and social context matters is important here. And then something that I've especially focused on in my work concerns skill. And this is where I could probably give a whole separate talk on what I consider skill. And it's pretty important to, I guess I should say a few words about it since it is pretty important to my general approach. But I consider it to mean quite a few things, actually. Now, in terms of methodology, how to measure it, that's a whole other issue and a big challenge. And I've worked on that for a long time, developing some instruments, but some other aspects of it, I think, still need a lot of work. But skill, it's part of the tricky issue with doing research in this area is that there isn't a uniform term for this concept that I consider skill. Some people refer to it as digital literacy. Some think about it as abilities, etc. I think about it as skill, but I think of it as a pretty broad range, anywhere from being aware of possibilities that one can use the internet for, to being able to do it, to being able to do it critically and well and efficiently. So that whole range is what I consider part of this skill concept. And then ultimately what's of interest is how these different factors feed into what people do with digital media and in the internet in particular. Finally, the big, huge question that should be of interest to social scientists especially is how skill and differences in types of uses ultimately might feed back into people's well-being and life chances. So does it make a difference in the end that you are using the internet for XYZ purpose? Does it make a difference for either your health or your financial status or your job opportunities or whatnot? As social scientists, I think that's one of the important questions, right? Because in and of itself, sure, it's interesting to look at what people are doing with the internet, but ultimately, how does that feed back into people's life chances, I think, is a really important question. And one that I think the field generally still struggles with, partly because of lack of appropriate data. So I thought I'd say a few words about data on internet users and internet uses. And again, I think this crowd, more than many, will probably be able to relate to these issues, but I thought I'd still say a few words about it just so you see where I'm coming from as I think about my own data collection and why I work with the data set that I've generated. So as you probably know, there's not a ton of data on internet users and tends to be pretty basic. And one of the challenges is that, again, lack of uniform terms means that it's hard to compare information across data sets, and also we're studying a moving target, so that's another challenge. Now, some people, when I say this, are really surprised, because from a different perspective, there is actually a ton of data, but that's about internet uses, and I want to make that distinction. So when it comes to internet uses, there's actually a lot of data, and it could be very detailed, and I'm referring to, say, log data generated by websites, right? And this is what I consider, what I refer to as the digital data paradox, this idea that on the one hand, we have unbelievable amounts of data that we didn't before about people's social behavior online because websites can track their own usage. On the other hand, we don't necessarily have that much detailed information and comparable data about users. And just a few words about why relying on log data can pose challenges. So first of all, becoming a user of a service is not a random event, right? So whatever website might have tons of data about its own users, but in fact, even something like Facebook that's thought of as completely ubiquitous, we know isn't equally used in different segments of the population. So again, it's not random who uses these websites. So whatever log data those websites have aren't representative of all internet users. So if we want to make comments about all internet users, we need to be really conscious of the fact that most specific sites' log data are biased in one way or another towards certain types of populations. The other thing is that people understand and use sites and services very differently, different component parts of their lives. So again, it's hard to know can you really compare one person's logs on a site to another person's logs if that site plays a very different role in their lives. What does that comparison then mean? And then also, it's very important to remember that site usage, whatever site usage, is just one medium in a whole area of media that people are using. So for example, if we're studying how people keep in touch with their friends, looking at interactions on one website will be incredibly limited if you have no data to then match that up with, say, their cell phone usage and how people are contacting their friends via another medium or even just traditional email or whatnot. So those are the challenges of relying on log data, and that's why I like to make the case for a continued need for traditional survey research, where some measures might not be as reliable, but on the other hand, we're able to gather information from all sorts of areas about people's social interactions and digital media uses. Okay, so just a shout out to my funders, and also that I was at Berkman last year when I was doing a lot of this research. Okay, so I thought I'd make a little bit of a policy link relating some of this work to some very current issues, at least in the United States, but I suspect relevant elsewhere too. Very soon after President Obama was elected well, by now it's like, I guess not last year, but in 2008, one of his first video addresses focused specifically about broadband adoption issues. And on the one hand, this was really exciting because here we had an administration that would now again care about the internet. On the other hand, this approach is somewhat limited, as I will argue, because, and as I have argued for about a decade now, because even after you take care of adoption issues, lots of differences remain among people in how they use the internet. So it was pretty exciting. About 10 days later, I actually got to go and talk to some people on the presidential transition team and pitch the idea that skill matters and it's much more than simple access issues. So then I was very excited that a few months later, well, first to see just how much money the government was putting towards broadband adoption, but also to see that beyond adoption, they were including issues of awareness and training in the stimulus package. Now, it's a little bit unclear where this is actually going, but at least it was in there. Okay, so in an ideal world, we would have data on people from a broad range of backgrounds. Most of my work is on US populations. So in an ideal world, I'd have data from people across the US. Unfortunately, I don't inhabit quite that ideal world, so I haven't been able to secure the kind of funding that's necessary to do large-scale surveys of nationally representative groups. And the surveys that exist, as I'm sure you know, Pew, for example, so they do some great data collection, but usually don't have the variables that are especially of interest to me, for example, skills, so I'm not able to rely on their data sets. And then other data sets just don't have the kind of detail, like the current population or the general social survey, that would be important. So I've had to collect my own data, but lacking funding to do national representative data collection, I have focused on one specific population. So those not that familiar with US geography, that smiley is supposed to be around Chicago. And so in particular, the University of Illinois, Chicago. Recognizing that you're probably really not familiar with Chicago geography in particular, I have a map for you. Okay, so why would I study the University of Illinois, Chicago? I'm at Northwestern, so Northwestern is up north in Evanston, and UIC is down south. Well, actually, smack in the middle of Chicago proper. It's about 20 miles away. There are lots of other schools in between, and we did most of the data collection in the dead of winter in person. So it's certainly not for convenience that we do our study at UIC. I just wanted to point that out. Rather, I've been studying students at UIC because they represent an incredibly diverse group of students. UIC is not the flagship campus of the University of Illinois system. That's Urbana-Champaign downstate. On the other hand, we know that we can control for basic literacy at UIC nonetheless. So it's proved to be a really great location to do studies. I've also been fortunate that there's a program on campus that's required of all first-year students. So unlike lots of studies where people go into a classroom, I'm able to work with this program that's required of all students, so there's no selection bias as to who's taking this course. So I get a representative sample of the first-year class of this diverse campus, so that's been very helpful. Collected data using paper, pencil. The reason is that partly I'm interested in skill, partly I'm interested in various internet uses. I don't want to do the data collection online so as not to bias against the people who might spend less time online, who might be less skilled, less comfortable taking such a survey. So even though it's one course, there are actually a lot of sections of it, so it's quite an elaborate process to do this data collection. That's why it takes a few months. But we do end up with a very diverse group. Now I want to say, because it is a very diverse group, but on the other hand, it is still first-year college students. So we're already screening out people who didn't go to college, and obviously it's a specific age group. Nonetheless, it turns out that these data are more representative than they might appear. A few years ago, so this is the second time that I've done this data collection in 2009, did another round in 2007, a totally different cohort, the first year cohort at that time, and published a paper specifically about students' selection into use of Facebook versus MySpace versus other social network sites, and found that basically race, ethnicity, and parental education predicted which site people would use. So back then in 2007, it was basically the Chronicle of Higher Education that decided to cover this, and the press otherwise wasn't that interested in the topic. And I tried to pitch it to some places, and they said, oh, well, it's just a Chicago school. We don't really care. It's not representative, whatnot. What was interesting is two years later, Nielsen came out with a press release based on their national data, basically very similar findings. And then the whole press covered it. But my point is that, in fact, my data set is quite representative in some ways, and findings are probably more generalizable than they might seem because the student body is so diverse. That said, it is important to remember that it is a specific population. So here's some information about the sample. But if anything, this means that if certain things turn out to be important, like socioeconomic status, presumably that would be even a bigger deal if we had an even more diverse set of people. Okay. So in some ways, the campus is different from other schools, for example, in that half of the students live at home with their parents for whatever reason. A lot of them work, and many of them are actually not US born. Okay, so one question is, can we speak of the wired generation? And indeed, these are students who've grown up with the internet pretty much. They've been online for years by now and spend a lot of time on the web. So indeed, we can call them the wired generation. This also applies to various mobile technology uses, certainly. And in terms of just their access to the basic physical infrastructure, everybody in the sample has easy access to either a laptop or a desktop. So basically, we're controlling for basic access. We've taken care of that. Everybody goes online. So then what I'm interested in, as I noted earlier, okay, once we've achieved basic access, do we observe differences after that? So while it is the wired generation, it's not the wired generation in every way. So for example, the majority of students have not used their mobile devices to go online. Also, while some sites, they use a lot, or more precisely, most of them use some sites, at least sometimes. Many other sites that get a lot of coverage in the press and get thrown around as universally diffused are actually not used that much at all, right? And these are data from less than a year ago, so this isn't like ancient data, and this would have all changed. And in fact, I collected data on these same questions on the cohort 2 years previous, and some of these numbers barely changed at all. So it's quite consistent. So I think that's interesting to note. And even something like comparing PhotoBucket with Flickr, where Flickr is much more the photo sharing site that has an interactive component, community component, et cetera, versus PhotoBucket, where it's much more a Often it's much more just where you dump your photos as opposed to being engaged. And so even just comparing the numbers there, which one is more popular, is interesting, I think. So again, I'm interested in whether there's a participation gap, especially with respect to use of sites where people are contributing content to the web, and thereby potentially influencing either conversations with other people's thoughts or opinions. So on this survey last year, I had some questions about whether people engage in certain types of activities. And so here are 5 activities that I consider to be, to one extent or another, online engagement. And they're somewhat different activities. Note that I purposefully didn't, I wasn't so much focused on a topic per se, so as not to bias towards types of people, but rather just, are you engaged in this type of activity on the web? And just to clarify, the way I actually asked about the question, the question offered 4 answer options. One was, so it was, how often have you done these things? And it was either never, once, 2 or 3 times, 4 or more times. So I have some granularity in terms of frequency. However, given how rarely some of these things are done, some of that granularity is actually not that helpful per se. So here is just responses to whether people engage in these activities at all. And we can see that none of them are activities that at least half the group does, which is itself, I think, interesting, because again, recall that this is a young group and it's a wired group. And if anyone's going to be doing these things, presumably it would be the young, wired people. And again, so if we were to ask these questions for populations that are less educated, that are older, we'd probably get much lower numbers. So you might be wondering why I haven't shown these figures in order of popularity. This is not how they were on the survey. So I think this is probably too cryptic a question, but does anybody want to take a guess as to why it's in this order? I think it's a little hard to guess, but.
This isn't a guess, but it's a question which might.
Okay, sure.
It seems. Was this creating a quiz or poll? That seems very high.
Like, what would that mean?
Well, I mean, I can't imagine that percentage of people do that.
It's the kind of thing on Facebook where you can create these quizzes and polls very easily.
Right, okay.
So I think that's where people do actually do it quite often. You know, those. I mean, I don't. If you use Facebook, you might know you get notifications about how your friend just took this and they came out as XYZ, and so
what
it.
kind of country are you?
Yeah, exactly, that kind of thing. So I think that's mainly what it's about.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Bernie.
If you're going to correlate it with another measure, quiz looks pretty déclassé, whereas Wikipedia is a very sophisticated sort of thing.
Okay.
Is that it? It's like either level of education, SES, or there's some sort of rank order there.
There is some rank order of some, well, which is interesting because that's actually not how it's listed, but I think is a comment on how it's listed. So does anyone else want to?
Well, we were muttering back here that it's related to level of skill and also level of general knowledge as well. So maybe one of those is the way you were thinking of it, and one of them is maybe a bias. Who knows?
Okay, so this is very interesting because I think you're right, and as the overall story that I'm telling unfolds, this will all come together. Let me show you what I have here. So I have it broken down by gender, and here are the numbers. And so basically we go from activities that are done by almost the same proportion of men and women versus increasing difference by the 2 genders. In that, you know, already uploading video men are more likely to do, but especially when you get to submitting a review and especially editing Wikipedia entries, men are just much, much more likely to engage in those activities. And so that's, I think, an interesting finding itself, and this will then relate to skill as I go on. Although, well, how am I thinking how the way this presentation is set up? I guess I'll say something because I don't have this presentation set up quite that way. A lot of my previous work has looked at predicting skill differences and explaining skill differences, and it'll come up in the slides, but basically those findings tend to suggest that women rate their skills lower than men for the most part, and it's a very complicated measure, and it's something that I've worked on a lot and have presented about a lot and written about. There are measures about self-efficacy, which I don't tend to use that much because I think those are even more gender biased. Pretty much any literature you look at that looks at people's confidence in doing anything, I mean, this is completely unrelated to internet use, men always score higher in their confidence of being able to do things. I mean, this is totally consistent in social science research. With respect to internet uses, so I've tried to move away from asking about confidence to asking about rating knowledge, which is not that different per se, but I would argue is a little bit different, and developed an instrument that I use that's made up of 27 items, and that's what I use as my skill measure, originally derived from a study where I also had data on actual skill measured in certain ways. And anyway, I have a few articles that talk about this, and it's pretty complex. I guess I'll say a few more words about this because it's quite central here, especially the way you've set it up. So I have a study where I show that if the outcome is how do people rate their skills based on this measure, gender is very much an important predictor in that women rate their skills lower. And that gender remains an important predictor even when you control for actual skill, so that's an issue. That said, then I have another study that looks at the self-rating, and in that study, which was published in Information, Communication, and Society in 2008, with Gina Walejko, we look at predictors of who shares content on the web, so in some ways related to some of these activities. And what we get is that women are less likely to share content, but when we include this self-rated skill measure, the effect of gender goes away. So whether perceived or actual, it seems to matter. And so that's why this is a pretty complex variable that I think requires a lot more work, a lot more thought. But I would argue that based on those different findings, whatever it is measuring exactly, it does seem to matter. And so that's important to keep in mind. So I'll move. Yes, go ahead, Grant.
Can I ask a question related to this? I mean, what struck me when I read that list is, in the context of your discussion that you just gave a moment ago, is the list of items there are concrete things. They're not, did you do, ever. Mm-hmm. They're not, do you have confidence that you could do? Right. Might you have done, would you want to do? Right. How well did you do it? Right, exactly. Anything like that. It's just binary
question.
Did you do it? Did you do it, right, or did you not do it? To what extent are the 27 items and the broader issues here related to the question of, did you do it or didn't you do it versus do you have confidence in doing it? How well can you do it? Would you like to do it? All the other sort of possible ways you could ask this question.
Right. So the 27 items are, I feel like I should look for a presentation that actually has that section. This is going to look like a mess on the video, but I think it would be easy. Well, I could just tell you, I don't know, I think usually visuals help, but the 27 item, the question there is, what is your level of understanding on the following internet-related terms? And it's presented as 2 separate list of questions on the survey. So first you're presented like 14 items and then 13 items later in the survey, and it's anything from things like JPEG, reload, bookmark, to things like social bookmarking, phishing, torrent, cache. And so at some level, it's still a self-rating. It's not about it's not phrased as a confidence issue. Obviously, it's still related to how you rate something you might know and how that comes across. It is a measure, again, that I have an article where I explain how I developed it in relation to measures of actual skill, and that this type of measure was the highest correlation compared to other measures people have used in the literature. I mean, it's certainly not perfectly correlated with actual skill by any stretch of the imagination, but it's the best that we've seen.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I can pursue that, but let's let you go on.
Okay, I mean,
Pursue it after.
feel free, because it's definitely central to the work and a lot of thinking I've done on this topic. Okay, so there was one thing where women reported engaging in it more, which is certainly a different type of activity, but I had on there, which was changing their privacy settings on Facebook, which isn't surprising, because I think just a lot of the rhetoric about how you have to be scared online is targeted more towards women than men. Not to say that you shouldn't be careful about your privacy settings, but I don't think it's surprising that the gender difference there goes in the other direction. And by the way, just because Grant, you commented on this, I actually do elsewhere on the survey ask about confidence with these activities. I haven't really looked at the details there, but it would be interesting, obviously, to see how that relates to the actually doing them question. Okay, so as I said, I also thought it would be interesting to look at the sum of the 5 activities, and so are there people who engage in everything, and how does that look in the data set? And so we have a quarter of the sample who just doesn't do any of this, which is interesting, because again, if this is supposed to be the super Dwyer generation that's really engaged, I think that's a pretty high number, because those are pretty different activities where you could be doing. And again, the measure was simply ever, right? Like, have you ever done this? So I think that's an important reality check. And then, as I said, I had these measures of, it said never once, 2 or 3 times, 4 or more times. And so I looked at, okay, so how many people actually do these 4 or more times? And we have a very small portion engaging these things, what I would call actively or often. So over 2/3 haven't done any of these things often, which I think, again, is a helpful reality check. So then I was curious to see how these things look by various background variables. So as you know already from the figures I gave you, this shouldn't be surprising. So there's a large gender difference. What's interesting, though, is that there's also considerable difference across race and ethnicity, in that people from various backgrounds engage in these activities to different extent. And we also see differences by parental education, which is my measure for socioeconomic status. And so students whose parents have less than a high school education are much less likely to be engaging in these activities than people whose parents have higher levels of education. And bringing all these things together, these variables, basically what we have is that if you take a Hispanic woman in the sample whose parents have less than a high school education, she will have engaged in about 1 of these activities, whereas if you compare her to an Asian male in the sample, he will have engaged in 3. So that's a pretty large difference by user background. And so, and by the way, I don't usually include this because a lot of groups I talk to wouldn't know what to make of it. I do have the regression results if anyone wanted to look at that later. I can pull up that table. Okay, so this is a very specific group that I was looking at, and even there we find quite a bit of difference by user background. So just imagine what differences we would find if we had a truly nationally representative sample where we weren't controlling for age and education. And I suspect the differences would be even larger. So in some ways, these are definitely conservative findings if we had a more diverse group.
Can I ask you just one more question?
Sure.
The p-values there those are dummy variables in a regression. Is that where the p-values come from? Or are those least significant difference tests or something like that?
Those are just t-tests.
Okay.
Okay, so generally speaking, kind of just bringing it all together, and here I refer to some other studies I've done that I did talk about because I kind of took a little side road. So I've looked at all these questions. These are outcomes I've examined in different projects I've done. Diverse types of uses, content creation and sharing, visits to interactive sites, engagement in online, engaging in content creation. And basically, pretty consistent findings across these different outcomes in that men tend to do them more, or at least they report doing them more. I mean, some feedback I've gotten in the past is that men might over-report more. I don't know. I haven't really gotten a very convincing argument as to why men might be over-reporting activities or women might be under-reporting actual activities. So I'm not totally convinced about that potential issue, although welcome thoughts on that. The other is socioeconomic status. So people from more privileged backgrounds tend to be the ones who engage in more of these activities, pretty much any of these activities. And then finally, what's been very consistent across studies is that skill definitely matters and that higher skill relates to higher levels of engagement. Of course, that's very tricky because that goes the other way too, right? The more you're doing, the more skilled you're going to be probably. So this is a very much goes both ways, and I think that's pretty hard to untangle, but I still argue that the more skilled you are, the more you're gonna know to do some of these things, that you actually do need some skill to pull off some of these things. Okay, so why would it be helpful to focus on skill? Well, let's go back to the stimulus package issue and language and just policy perspectives. So certain things, while we can, hope to improve people's financial status and education, those require much larger levels of intervention than potentially than something like trying to educate or train people specifically about internet usage. So I think it's a fruitful area to study and to look at and to think about because it is quite open potentially to policy intervention. So I think that's why it's helpful to think about. Not that we have figured out how to do it, but I think it's an area that's definitely worth thinking about and studying to know how to do it well in terms of intervention for improved skills. So overall, what I hope is the takeaway for you from this talk is that skill very much matters beyond basic access when it comes to differentiated internet uses, and just because we control for access doesn't mean that people are now going to be taking advantage of everything that's online equally. And just that there's this important component potentially of mentoring, education, and support. Although, again, there's tons of research that needs to be done in that realm in particular. And so, put another way, some of you might recall that in 2006, Time came out with the Person of the Year as you. But my argument is that it's actually some of you, or more precisely some of us in this room, who are really those people, and it's not really you, the universal you, because it's actually very specific segments of the population that this applies to. So you can find copies of the various papers I referred to on webuse.org/pubs, and that's my talk for you today.
Thank you.
Questions are usually sort of fairly free-for-all.
Yeah,
Right,
go for it. Yeah, I'd
stuff.
love to hear comments, questions. I sort of threw out some questions myself, so if people have thoughts. Bernie, go for it.
I found myself having to accept a premise about online engagements somewhere between there that
you're not willing to accept.
I think there's
Not
a
ready
couple
to.
things in there that might explain this other than merely skill, and especially in relationship to the issue about gender. And what I noticed, a quiz is something that people will do for their friends. Wikipedia is something they'll do for the public, and in between them, you have a similar, almost like a ranking of that which is done for the self and that which is done, or the personal network and that which is done for the wider public. And so this online engagement, it would seem that what you're picking up on men doing is men are doing things for the internet, or almost for ego gratification, or something other than their immediate friends. If you were to, so my question is, if you were to measure in some way whether people are interested in engaging via the internet for their friends versus engaging the internet itself, do you think you could tease apart some of these discrepancies?
So that's an interesting point. I mean, I think of the activities listed here, you could probably, I mean, it's mainly the quiz where you could argue that it's for the networks, personal networks, right? And all the others are more for the public. I mean, I don't know if someone wants to disagree, that's
Well, I mean,
fine.
upload a video is still something that you can have a network of people you know on YouTube, and most people have some.
I mean, I think you can actually make that argument for these three, and Wikipedia is I think the Wikipedia, that's definitely much more for the public. I think these three really depends on the site where you might be doing it, whatnot, so I think those are tricky. I think that's an interesting point. I still think that it matters in the sense that a lot of the excitement about the web and people getting their voices out there and this whole idea of democratizing the public sphere is about people influencing conversations potentially beyond just their social networks, right? That you're actually getting stuff completely out there, that you're able to influence more than just your fairly constrained network. And so in that sense, I think it is important to look at whether the gender difference exists, regardless of, I mean, for even those more public activities.
Yeah.
So were you asking whether,
So
should I try to measure it differently in the sense of trying to get at, like, who are they targeting, or?
What I would, if we were in that magical let's do it all over again.
Yeah, sure.
world,
I'll do it over again one day.
Oh, okay. I mean, one thing I would ask is whether they have known friends on any of these sites. Because we know that people who have friends on Wikipedia do edit more on Wikipedia, and I demonstrated the same thing on Dig. And it seems to be that within each of these sites, if you have a known group, people will participate more. So whether that
those
is a more
groups
salient factor for men or women in terms of degree.
Right. So are those groups the ones you're referring to from prior research, but even just moving forward? I mean, are those groups that existed prior to starting to use these sites, or are they friendships that people created? Because that matters too, to some, right? I mean, that has different implications, I think, and which doesn't mean it doesn't matter. But I think it actually, this opens up whole other areas of complication, which is, well, it's social science, of course it does, but.
The follow-through to that is whether you have sort of an increasing, not a participation divide where some groups are closed by gender.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely, and any of you who spend time on some of these online sites know that, in fact, they can be quite hostile to women much more often than hostile to men, right? I mean, there's different degrees of that going on at different spaces, that even if you're just kind of informally reading through the text, I mean, yeah.
Like the bully brigade on Wikipedia,
Well, there's that, or, on Reddit, seriously, just the comments about, women and how they look, and just a lot of these threads immediately turn into that type of discussion, which is hardly equally friendly to a female versus a male audience. But yeah, it's an interesting angle on this. Thanks. Yes?
So I guess I'm following up on Bernie's comment from a different angle. So my question is about your motivation, this argument about democratizing, about checking whether the internet is really democratizing access to the public domain. And I was wondering, what kind of implications you're finding have for that line of argument, because, so do we want everybody to contribute to, so is democratizing editing articles on Wikipedia good per se, or I'd rather have experts updating articles, not a representative sample of the population updating. So in a way, I'm following up on Bernie's because I think these measures of online engagement refer to very different things, and so, how different users might engage in these activities, so that might have different implications for the generic argument on democratizing. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question, and just as a side note, I would be very eager to hear from folks, you others, what you think are other things that one could ask about engagement. I spent a lot of time thinking about and pre-testing and talking to people about, what are the items that I should include given a limited size on a survey often. And so that I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But to answer your question, I mean, I think partly what's motivating is just, again, that there's so much theoretical discussion of the democratized public sphere, whatever way we want to see that, and very little empirical investigation on general populations of how, to what extent that happens, right? So you have case studies of, oh, look at how many people edit Wikipedia, or look at how many people do X, but again, that completely samples on the active users already as the study, as that's part of the study design. So I think it was important to look at a much more diverse sample to see who, if the whole premise, if the starting point is, oh, you're active, let's see who you are, rather you are a person and let's see what you are actually active in, right? Okay, so then your question of, well, so I guess at some level you're asking, do we actually want to democratize these things? Do we want everybody commenting? Well, you're certainly right that it's not as though more voices is necessarily better, right? That's absolutely right. So in some ways, I think those who've watched the evolution of some of these sites like Reddit, I mean, it seemed like the more people started showing up, the worse it got, and just the quality of conversations completely plummeted. And I think that happens often. So that suggests that it's not always a good thing. The idea is that diverse voices to some extent nonetheless would be helpful to have, especially when you can point out things like it's much more male voices versus female. I think it's important to note that. It's an interesting question of, how deep do you dig of, well, so who do we, what's sort of the normative argument of who should be the ones who are, we're okay with contributing? That's a tricky question. It's an interesting one. I don't know if you have thoughts on it.
It's a normative question, and so in that sense, I guess I'm not convinced that representativeness in contributions to Wiki. So I guess I'm not convinced about the connection you sort of implicitly made about pure, sort of having a representative sample of people contributing to all these activities and this democratization argument. I guess I'm not convinced about
Okay, so you're saying that basically my operationalization is not very good.
Well, I'm saying that you might not be...
Which is fair.
To infer some...
I'm just trying to understand what you're...
Well, there's two different things. One is, let's see who's using these services online. Let's see who's contributing most to Wikipedia or whatever, according to the classic demographic variables. That's interesting per se. Now, another matter is whether you can jump from this more normatively oriented argument that that's good per se. As you said, that's a complicated question, and I don't think that... So in this particular context, analyzing Wikipedia contributions and how representative they are can tell you a lot about the normative aspect of representativeness. Because it's not a forum where people discuss about politics. Wikipedia is also about facts, and so representativeness.
That's complicated, but so there's someone who's been trying to jump in, so let's let him contribute.
Yeah, I'm just getting in that democratic sense. It strikes me skill-wise, there's different forms of public voice that people take, and not only the technical skills and the skills to use tools, but the skills to exercise a public voice might be quite a big factor in here. So the skill to exercise just to speak in public by creating a YouTube clip that's just for fun, or to speak in the skill to speak in a space where people don't agree with you, or the skill to speak in a space in order to advance the agenda, are all sorts of different skill sets that, if we believe technology for democratization, they're as important, if not more important than the technical skills, because they'll motivate people to get the technical skill. And I don't know how we measure those, but they seem quite significant.
Yeah, and I mean, just to be fair, conceptually, although, again, my operationalization doesn't really reflect this right now, I mean, I think of skill as much more than, can you press a button or that kind of stuff, but it's true that the way I've measured it so far reflects much more the technical component. Bernie, you wanted to jump in earlier?
I think he said it very
okay.
well. That's demonstrating that this is a proxy for not necessarily quality, but for whether the conditions on these sites allow for a broad number of people to exercise themselves in public. And clearly it's showing that there is, regardless of the quality of the content, the welcomingness of the site to produce content is not optimal right now. And if we can't normally say we want this type of skill and that type of skill, at least we want to say we want to make it welcome to whoever should be wanting to contribute.
Yes?
But I wasn't talking about quality. I was talking about representativeness, which is different.
Well, yes, but I do think it's related, right? Because you were making the argument, you were talking about quality because you were saying, well, don't we want experts to do it because they, that sort of, isn't there an inherent issue about quality there
But
that you're referring to?
You're measuring the means, not the outcomes, ultimately, right?
No, definitely here.
You're implying that they are related, and I'm wondering whether they actually are related. Sometimes you just need an elite of experts to create a very high quality product. Political representativeness it's not really as important in places like Wikipedia as in forums where people discuss about politics, whatever policies are being implemented. I think representativeness means substantively different things because it allows to get different outcomes in different web sort of services. That's what I was trying to say.
Helen, you've had your hand up a few times now.
Yeah, it was just this question of skill. You mentioned it and you said it's a problem, but I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how you did measure it, because in a way you might see it as a kind of showstopper. Just because the internet is so much something that you just get on and do, and teach yourself, as it were, or learn from friends in so many ways, and don't get formal training. I'm just thinking of a friend of mine who got a computer about a week ago for the first time ever, so never used the internet. And every now and then she rings up and says all the things she's done, and it seems to me that you would measure her skill by what she. Her skill has changed radically in the last 10 days or whatever it is, and so would her rating on here have changed. I don't know if she's got to these things yet, but she's certainly doing things she's never done before. How can you separate those things? Because in a way the skill is having done it. Something like that.
Well, to some extent,
unless it's exactly what sort of Tim was saying, in that it's your skill to participate in the public world or whatever, which is
right. Well, I think so. The way I argue, so I don't think your friend goes against what. So if she was in this data set, I don't think she would sort of throw into question the results or show up as a confusing case, because she, in fact, would rate low on the skill measure. She probably wouldn't understand a lot of the terms that I measure, right?
But is that how you measure it?
That is the skill that I've been using.
What, you ask them about terms and what they mean?
Yeah. Well, I don't, it's not a multiple choice. It's their level of understanding. Let me look for a presentation that has the... But that's what it is. It's rate your level of understanding.
Right, and then they look at these terms and they say whether they understand
They
them
score themselves on a 5-point scale. I wonder if this one sort of... No. I used to talk about this a lot and then started taking it out from... Sorry.
Can I press you on this? I know you're
Sure.
thinking what you're doing, but can I press you on this? Because I'm really interested in the idea of, and I've been trying to find people to give me a clear answer. I've never been able to, and I was hoping today you would, of whether we have any measures of how good people are at, say, search. How effective they are at getting what they want, and in what ways they get better or not. And I've asked people who run Yahoo Europe, and they don't know.
Yeah, no.
So when you say skill and understanding of terms, that seems to be a quite different thing from are you any good at what you're doing and are you succeeding?
Yeah, so that I have a response to this, but I don't know if I'm gonna respond to this before taking the other questions, comments. So I guess the short answer is we don't really have good measures for this. My longer answer is that was actually a lot of my motivation for work that So 10 years ago when I started doing related work, I was looking specifically at information seeking and was observing people and looking at what they were doing and tried all sorts of survey measures at the same time. And unfortunately, a lot of these questions about things like, I would ask people things like, do you ever use quotes when you put in a search term? And thinking that would be a measure of sophistication, but it turns out if you observe people and you observe how they're using quotes, they're not using them correctly. So they might tell you they use it, and then you might walk away of that as a measure of sophistication, but in fact, it's not. So like I would have users who'd put quotes around one word, meaningless, right? So that's not helpful. And I had all sorts of other related questions that I've tried that don't work because of this. I've seen that we've done in my lab hundreds of observations at this point of people's information search, and I think at this point I don't think the field is quite ready for the survey level approach to that question, which is tricky, obviously, because observing people is super expensive and time sensitive, and so I have a few papers coming through the pipeline under review right now that analyze from a qualitative perspective. But no, I mean, generally speaking, if you dig deeper, even at this age, a lot of students don't really know to do these things as carefully as they should. But again, if you just ask them, do you find what you need? They might think they have, even if they went to a completely misleading website, which is what we find not often, but certainly sometimes with their answers to some of our questions. So they'll go to a website that isn't at all about what it purports to be about, and they don't know that. So the answer to that question would be, yeah, I find it, and they don't know that they're being completely led astray. So I think that's why it's very complicated for survey questions. Also, we've focused specifically on credibility issues in some of these studies, and we've replicated some of the survey instruments that credibility studies tend to ask. And again, they show no correlation to what comes through the qualitative information. So I think that's a whole field that just needs a lot of improvement and work.
One of the things that worries me is that now, I know you know this, is that this question's got some of the properties of certain philosophical problems, like, do you see red and green the way I do? Because the sort of privacy of it, not in the usual sense of privacy, but we don't know how other people search, we don't know how we search, because we've no way of discussing it with each other. I mean, even experts really have no way of discussing with each other. I mean, are you any good at this? You can't ask people that. So we don't know. Any one of us, computer science professionals, may be searching very badly, or they don't know.
Right, well, that's definitely part of it as well. Exactly, which is why, again, you can't really just ask people, are you good at it?
It's a bit opaque to survey, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so...
Where are we going? Who's next?
Well, we had a couple of people in the back. Yes?
Well, I just want, following up with the last comment you said, I want to ask if you think that it might be important to differentiate between a sort of wide scope of what we mean by internet skill and a narrow scope. So if we think of skill as being good at performing an activity, then the narrow scope of internet skill presumably means how good are you at performing activities that take place online. And that could be activities that are important in one's life or activities that are not important, whereas the wider scope could be how do you use the internet to help you perform activities in the course and over the course of your life. And as I was looking at the sort of breakdown between men and women, and one significant or possible explanation that I would be, or of some of the differences at least, would be the prevalence of video games, and video games, online video games specifically, as a way that at least my generation, I think, became accustomed to using the internet. And in video games, you not only have the video game itself, but you also have game forums where people are sharing tips about and tricks about the game. You have the creation of communities surrounding these video games. And I mean, I don't know the statistics, but my guess is that video games have and continue to be primarily male-dominated in terms of players. So I'm wondering how much sort of the skill set that you've chosen reflects that specific, that specific difference, just which is a difference between how internet skills are developed rather than a difference in how internet skills are deployed in the wider sense of, do you use the internet to find directions or shop online or those sort of life activities that we might use the internet for.
Right, so I think this gets back a little bit to Helen's comment about that the skill measure and the activity measure are a little bit too close, potentially. I think the video game issue, I think there might be something to it. There's actually, someone once made a really interesting comment to me after a talk that I think is along those lines, specifically about how men or even boys are probably more likely to engage in less acceptable forms of behavior online, whether that be looking for cheat codes for games or looking at pornography, and thus need to learn, for example, how to either get those things that are much less obviously accessible or that are not really accepted, and thus they need to figure out how to hide their tracks. And so whether some of these types of less publicly desirable activities lead boys or men more than girls or women to hone some of their skills, and whether that's part of it, which I think I've never really seen work done on that, and I think it's a really interesting potential. Pirate, yeah, that's definitely another one, exactly. And again, I don't really know the literature on the gender breakdown of those things. I mean, another one that I had, another hypothesis I had that I actually did start measuring in this survey was upbringing and how children are raised in terms of the extent to which parents limit their online activities due to various fears. And it's very interesting. I think I might have. So I asked the respondents what rules their parents had for them as they were growing up. So this is going, they're reflecting on their upbringing. And so broken down by gender, basically, just look at the last one, right? So just that there's so much of this rhetoric that it's girls who need to be super scared when they're online, and how that then leads parents to limit potentially girls' time online. And whether that then means that girls are experimenting less. I mean, sort of online experimentation is probably one important way to gain skills, and whether that's one way that girls might be limited in how much they're out there exploring and gaining skills because they're being limited in their uses. Again, the problem is that pretty much no one, I mean, there are very few other survey studies that try to measure skill in any way. And so it's just really hard to make progress because, it's not that often that I get to run these bigger studies and to then add better and better measures. But I definitely agree that I need to.
One suggestion would be maybe to pick activities that everybody engages in and that sort of aren't specific to the internet, like buying stuff or finding out what time movies are playing, and then seeing how often people use the internet to perform those. Yeah,
well, so now you're raising a somewhat different issue, and I have actually in the past been able to control, for example, I have in the past been able to control for something like engaging in an activity at all versus online, and while it's related, it doesn't make all those other factors go away. And the other thing that I control for in this study and have done so in the past as well is interest in a type of topic. And again, while it's actually not always, but sometimes related, it certainly doesn't it doesn't diminish, it might diminish, but doesn't erase the effect of the other variables.
You couldn't give them a little test, could you?
Well, this is what's tricky on a survey.
What sort of survey is it? Is it telephone, face-to-face?
It's paper, pencil.
The survey?
Yeah.
But face-to-face then?
Paper, pencil. No, they're filling out a survey.
Right,
like
and
a
then
paper.
Send it in.
That we collected.
Oh, right, okay.
But why not?
If you could do a little test online, seems like they could all do it online. I mean, then you could give them a little. So
this really is pretty complicated. So I have colleagues who've tried to do things like that. If you're doing an online survey, which again, I mentioned why I haven't done my surveys online, you could build in a component like that. It's pretty tricky. There have been some trials of that. I think to come up with that one question that really captures it would be pretty difficult. Yeah, sure. Grant, you had your.
Yeah, I was thinking.
Sorry.
Going back to Yorick's question about the search thing. Instead of asking people, do you do quotes, give them a search string, and then ask them for a search string with quotes around a single word, and then give them choices. The quotes mean this word is very important. The quotes mean this word should be ignored.
Yeah, so I have started doing that. I've done some multiple choice questions like that.
Right, and that's the test.
Yeah, so that I have actually done that, not on the big survey. I mean, not the full sample. I've done it on subsamples of 100. And it takes up much more survey space to ask one of those than to ask one of the, which I was pointing out. And why don't you ask or make your comment? And I'm sorry,
I was just going to make a
missed
comment
you.
that a lot of what we've talked about so far in terms of skill has been skill at the individual level, and I was really, I know that your overall research framework pays a lot of attention to context, and the work that I've been recently doing about people who are considered to be non-users of the internet is that they often have kind of are proxy users of the internet. So I was wondering if you'd asked about teaching people to do other things and what you found out about people's reporting of their skill in terms of their ability to help others, or their having asked for help from other people, and how you sort of put those relationships into your framework of skill.
Yeah, very good point. So I did ask about that on this survey, and it was interesting because, unfortunately, I guess the way I asked, the one about whether they help others, I didn't ask it in the right way because there's almost no variance. So almost everybody reports helping their parent or helping a sibling. So the way I asked it clearly, it wasn't the right way to ask it. I did also ask about what sources they turn to for advice. I haven't looked at that part of the data set yet, but obviously should incorporate into this section for sure. So I do have some data on that, and would be happy to share the questions that I used. And one more type there that I used was whether they, a few related to parents again, when they were growing up, for example, whether their parents ever paid them to help them with something, or whether, so I have a few questions like that as well. So it's both more current and more from the past, but I still need to look at that. But anyway, so this is just to get back to the question of what's the skill measure here. And here it's just this index, and I have two separate articles, this was actually in 2009, that look at this. And the second article, actually, what I did there was, okay, so the first one talks about relating this measure to the actual measures, where the actual was mainly related to information seeking, and then, which itself poses limits, of course. This second one, what I did there was that I actually included bogus items, a few non-existing items, to see how they would rate, and they ranked the lowest, so I think that helps validate the instrument, because some in the past people have suggested that, what if they're just randomly checking stuff off, and so.
What proportion of people answered that they had an understanding of the bogus?
There were definitely some people who did
because
say.
Survey research says you can invent something like, what do you think about American policy toward
people will say,
et cetera, and make up a country name, and you'll get anywhere from 5
absolutely.
to 25%
and
of the population will approve of it.
Right. No, so first of all, there was a question on the survey as a whole that measured attentiveness, and I took out all the people who didn't answer that correctly. So it was about 4%, I think. So they're just not in the sample at all. And then I had the bogus items, so some people still said they had a high level of understanding, but overall they still showed the lowest average. So that was helpful to know. In the bogus items, that's a good question. I didn't check that. That's a good question.
Grant and Helen earlier raised the possibility of actually testing people. Has anybody actually done that? Ask people to find a quote or find its author, or just simple finding out things by search. Has anybody ever tested that? Whether people are any good at it?
That's the kind of research I've done.
Well,
that's what
you're asking them things. You're asking them about themselves to report.
No.
I'm not actually testing if they can do it.
No, that's where this whole came. That's where the whole. No, that's not what this study. No. I'm saying that these measures, the ones I report on in the 05 paper, are from a study where I observed them, created measures from that observation, and then I also had survey measures. And I correlated the two.
Targets? You can actually find the targets.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
Whether they could find it and how long they took. And so, yeah, and I've done lots of studies like that since then. And that's what I was referring to as much more of it is qualitative, though, in terms of the outcome. Yes?
Well, just on that topic, I know that Google has there's a way you can get paid to perform searches on Google. Like they'll pay you, however much an hour to just go and find different items, and it's Google's way of checking that the search engine works. I mean, maybe it'd be worth just obtaining or asking Google to, if there is a gender breakdown in terms of who performs those tasks, and they also rate each as you work for Google, like in this program, your skill level, the higher skilled you are, the more you get paid. So if you perform more sort of tasks, because you're paid on an hourly basis, the more tasks you perform in an hour, the more you can get paid.
We had good people from the Google usage group here last week.
They won't
And
know.
I asked them that question, and they said they didn't know.
They won't know the demographic of the people.
Sure, but they could put up, but I'm saying you could put out or like if they agreed, put out a survey, and then you at least have all the, then it's a matter of asking all the people who already participate in this program, to
Yeah, I mean, so there are different levels of challenges there, and probably barriers. So yeah, I do have contacts at Google, and they're even funding one of my new projects, which is specifically on looking for complex health questions online. But again, they use very different methods. They don't tend to have social scientists on the team, which is presumably why they fund some outside, which is nice. And again, they don't collect the demographics. They wouldn't know what some of those details are that they might want to collect. They're not huge fans of survey research, I know that. So, I mean, and it's definitely not a representative sample of the people who work there. So I guess maybe certain questions that might work with. I also doubt that they would let any of that data out. I mean, I could maybe on one of my visits while on campus, I could look at it, but I'm not, again, it's so not representative just who works on that I mean, I guess you're partly suggesting just the change to see how is that partly what you're suggesting this for? To measure the change in there?
Well, no, I get to measure the gender difference.
The gender difference. Well, again, I just think it's such a non-representative. I mean, they don't try to go for representativeness ever. I mean, it's just not how they think about this. So, okay, but I don't know which one of you had your hand up first. Bernie, go for it.
Okay. I wanted to go back to the very beginning of your presentation when you were at least hinting that there might be some implications here for larger stratification issues.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this relate to, how would this research speak to sort of issues of educational and occupational stratification, Bourdieuian sort of distinction-based stratification, Elysian kind of figuration stratification? You want to just tell me if there's any implications here.
It's a beautiful rundown of all the theories.
I was picking
very
four,
nice.
so off the top of my head.
Well, so I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting you bring that up because it's true that that general framework is not completely in line with then how I pitched this project, which is the public, participation in the public sphere. And then so the question is,
I was wondering if I just missed something.
Can you so what is the link between participation in the public sphere and well-being? I mean, I think, again, this is one of those points where we can go back to my operationalization and can we make an argument for how some of these things, where's the list, might be related to, and what exactly are these things measuring, right? And are they measuring things that that might help you? I mean, I think you could make an argument that if you're active on some of these sites, like the ones where you're reviewing things or voting on things or whatnot, that first of all, it means that you're aware of these websites, number one, which means that you could be gaining, so you know where to go to get information that's an alternative source potentially. And then I think there you could argue that if you know of those sites and are actively involved in them, then you could easily be getting information that's not necessarily as easily available to the mainstream, and thereby you could potentially be gaining insights that might allow you to further your position in one way or another, right? To hear about that new job opening sooner than others, or to know which product to buy and not get screwed, and buying the really lousy one for a higher, or, where to get the cheap things. So I think, I actually do think that there's potentially some link there.
Right, and the stratification questions are much larger than, of course, getting, as I'm sure you're well aware, than products and services and handling those. I mean, there are issues of how do you even know what is a good education, or
oh no, I mean
shared
absolutely.
jobs, or in
Right.
sense, the ability to handle. The fact that I could change a Wikipedia entry doesn't add to my cultural capital necessarily, because the cultural capital is defined by a group of people who I have no access to, and they're going to ignore me.
Well,
They
I think
don't
that's a
care if I
yes
make
and
a comment
no.
or not.
I think you could make the argument though that it might, and I think this relates to
could,
Bernie's
yes.
point also about, and I mean in that sense actually it's interesting because I think from that perspective Bernie's point would almost say that the personal network ones are the more important ones to participate in because, well, it's in your personal networks that you want to be gaining more capital of various sorts, right? Like if you're participating in if you're contributing to a network, an online site that is where people are participating, then you might be actually gaining capital that you can benefit from better than the Wikipedia one where it's all these unknown people. So, I mean, that's an interesting
Right.
different way
I mean,
to look at this.
It's an argument you could make. I don't know that anyone, I don't know, perhaps you do, but I don't know. No one has successfully made it against a good Bourdieuian distinction argument, I think. Although certainly people
I mean, I do think that using the internet can help in those ways, in the sense that, in the past you'd have to go to that museum to then be at this party and have that conversation about their latest exhibit. And now you can go online and check out that new exhibit and check out what they write about it and then have sophisticated things to say about it or whatnot. I mean, I think, I do actually think that there are all sorts of online activities you can engage. Not to mention that I think some would argue that even being able to talk in a sophisticated manner about online phenomena might get you some capital in certain circles, right? So even to be able to say, oh yeah, when I edit Wikipedia entries, and then you're the one who was really in the know. And so, I mean, I think that is possible depending on the circles. Yes.
Although, I mean,
Oh yeah, I was sort of Bernie next, sorry.
Bernie didn't
It's totally related to this, too.
that was related to Brent's point as well.
Oh, well.
But he had his hand up.
You know what? But earlier she had to wait for like an hour before I called on her. So why
That
don't you go?
That goes for several people, not just him.
But I guess my concern is with the whole kind of the well-being question is that yes, we could argue that being online is better for developing certain kinds of social capital, but if you're looking at the really marginalized people, the push factors are so high. It's not just, oh, I'll get a better job if I go online. It's I have to go online in order to get any job. And that actually is a way in which there are increased barriers to social inclusion that are the result of a perception by people who already have lots of power that the real deal is getting online and being online. And so I think that's also makes skill very complex because there are many skills that are now absolutely basic to participating at all in a society like the United States. And that's actually quite troubling from a policy perspective in many ways. So it's a sort of dark side of the, of your connection back to well-being.
Oh, absolutely. Well, there is a dark side for sure, because there are people who are being left behind, and the idea is precisely that it's the less privileged who are taking advantage and participating in all these things less. And again, partly back to Grant's point, this is just one of many studies that, as that one slide summarized, where I have all these different outcomes, right? And it's always the same predictors. And so the predictors are extremely consistent, whether it's contributing to Wikipedia or visiting various websites or sharing content. It's very consistent, the findings. But to that point, even nowadays, to get a job at McDonald's, often it says, go to our website, apply here. That's a big problem. And partly it's a big problem, okay, where do they get the access? But I would, again, argue that even once you get the access, it's not necessarily that obvious to know how to fill out that form if you've never been on a website. So I think there is still that skill component in that kind of a case as well.
My personal favorite, is the immigration and naturalization site in America, where you can't make an appointment with him. It's not called him a Nats anymore. You can't make an appointment with him a Nats now without making an appointment on the web. If you think of who the clientele of him and Nats are,
yeah,
it's
that's
extremely interesting restriction, isn't it?
Yes.
In other words, I would suspect the majority of their clientele aren't online.
Yeah.
But they
There is
can't
a library.
get what?
The librarians are filling out all these forms for people.
Well, they do hand you a thing at the door of him and that saying, if you aren't online, go to your library. But again, it's a very bizarre piece of behaviour.
Yeah.
It was Helen and then Bernie, I think.
How did Bernie get further down the...
Because he's had lots of time, that's why.
It's the last time I say the first thing, because other people have, that's
No,
okay.
no, go on, it's all right, Bernie, go on.
Women have larger networks on Facebook. They talk with more of their friends on Facebook. They tend to use email more frequently. In terms of online engagement, in other ways in which people are doing with direct friends, women do more online stuff. Now, the question for me is not how do we get women doing what men do, is there a quality difference in the sort of things that women do more of, which we know that there are things they do more of, and the quality difference between the sort of things that men do more of. Some of the things we were talking about earlier, this Bourdieuian cultural capital, are people getting more cultural capital by having a friend feed of many weak ties from diverse sources, or more cultural capital from going on Wikipedia? And I'm not sure it's clear that it's Wikipedia, because sites like Wikipedia, Reddit, Yelp, if all participation is local, then people might actually be just participating in one small corner of Wikipedia where everybody knows sort of the same information and they're niggling over whether this carburetor is better than that one. Whereas on Facebook, you get exposed to God only knows what sort of information from all sorts of weak ties that people pick up.
Well, so I mean, I think you make an interesting point, but I do think you also, there was an interesting shift in your, well, maybe
Sure.
you didn't mean it as a shift, but that's kind of how I heard it. So first you started talking about how women have all these ties online and they cultivate them, and I was thinking strong ties, but then by the end of your question you were talking about weak ties, and I'm not completely convinced that, although, I mean, I don't know how much we know about this part of women's online communication, whether that's really mainly with the strong or the weak ties in their lives, and it seems to me that some of these activities that men might be engaging in might actually be more likely to lead to weak ties or new information, right? That whole issue of non-redundant ties and new and it seems to me, I mean, you might be like often in touch with your circle of friends, but if they all have the same info, that, I mean, it's just the strength of weak ties argument where I'm going with this. And so, I mean, I don't think it's completely obvious. This probably requires more work as to whether some of these activities that men are more likely to engage in might actually lead to weak ties, right? And new ties. New weak ties.
Well, this is an answerable question, fortunately, and I'll be real quick, and then I'll just say maybe I'll answer it. I don't know.
We're getting towards the end.
Because
I'm going back on my thing.
because we do know we do know women have more.
Giving him a 10, he won't give up.
Okay, that's fine.
No, answer it, Bernie. I mean, I'm curious to know.
No,
What the,
it's just if the network structure on Facebook networks of men and women are similar, and women just have on average larger networks, then we can't say that they're not cultivating weak ties.
but what are you saying? Are you saying that this has been studied and we know?
Well, I have a bunch of networks of college students, and we already know from Cameron Marlowe's work the baseline estimates for participation in Facebook networks, and his work is for like all Facebook networks.
And his findings were with respect to this question.
Women talk with more of their women talk with more of the people in their network. It's by a factor of like 0.3 or 0.4.
Okay, I guess it's still not clear how that addresses the weak tie question specifically and new ties.
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Well, it was back to the skills point, sorry, but it was just this point about, I was wondering how, I mean, if one of the key questions about skill is how advantaged people are in terms of getting a job, how do employers actually, I mean, if it's the case that you can't get a job with internet access, is that what employers use, this basic kind of, if they can fill on the online form, you know, they must be able to use the internet, which is something I myself use in various contexts, you know. We use it, for example, in our experimental lab, where we pay people to participate. We don't want them.
Absolutely.
We don't want them if they can't use the internet.
Right.
So we don't make the online application process, you know, too simple.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't always work. I mean, how do employers do it? I mean, but I wouldn't mind betting they don't ask them, do you know what a bookmark is, or do you know what advanced search is? Yeah, what do we know about that?
I don't know. I mean, I will say that I think your thinking is more sophisticated about this than some of theirs, because I don't think you really need to use the internet to work in certain jobs at McDonald's, even though they require to apply through the website, right? I mean, it's
Well,
not...
It would make sense for them if you did, surely, because then they can interact with you online rather than having to send you bits of paper or anything. So it could well make economic sense for them if all they
Okay, well,
do is
that part
use
makes
the-
sense. I was thinking of just them actually performing on the job, right? Some of the things that people do
I've
on
seen
their
McDonald's
job.
employees who find it quite hard to push the keys on the. Quite hard. I mean, on McDonald's keys, they actually have the food on the keys, and I've certainly seen McDonald's employees who're quite bad at that. So I mean, I think it might be quite a sensible training machine.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think it would be rational.
But yeah, so I don't really know that much about that work. I've actually, I don't think there's too much about that from what I can tell, because I'm just starting a project on kind of the other side of it, how people use digital media in their job search process, and it turns out there's almost nothing on that, which is...
No, I know. I've done work on that too, and that is extraordinary. The lack of work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was really shocked when I decided to do a project on that, and I was thinking, oh, there's going to be all this work, and I'll figure out this little tiny question, and I thought, oh, there's no work. And it didn't look like there was a ton from the employer's perspective either. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
I
yeah,
don't-
but I mean, they
don't-
don't know anything also about the effectiveness or otherwise of their online provision of job search. I mean...
Yeah, no, I mean, we really just don't know this, which is, I think, fascinating that there's so little work on that. But just, I mean, getting back to the, would they ask do you know what a bookmark is? I mean, the point of that question isn't, I never really use just the answers to the individual items, because I really think of it as an index, a more general measure. And I'm not arguing that if you know what a bookmark is, you will X, right? It's more that, as you know, I mean, in survey research, we need to ask questions that get at something. And this is an instrument that I've developed that, I mean, I think, based on some of the articles I've published that are more methodological in nature, I think I've made a pretty strong argument why I think it is a helpful measure. I do think we need to refine it and have questions that get at other aspects. But I don't want people to read too much into it about, do you mean everyone needs to know what a wiki is? No, that's not really the point per se.
We have to stop, but can I just, in closing, take you back to a point that Bernie raised earlier? I mean, you refer. The phrase came up early on about whether some networks were gender closed, and my question is, I mean, my anecdotal experience of Facebook is, I'm much more likely to find somebody's network of friends that is nearly all women than nearly all men. Now, that may just be a fact about me, so I'm asking if there's research on that. But my question is there research on sort of gender closedness of Facebook groups? And the other question is about size, which you've raised. I mean, I thought there was lots of evidence that you can't know that many people. Now, since with time people's groups of friends are growing monotonically, more or less, people don't do a lot of pruning, I suspect. So I mean, it will follow that as time goes on, people can't know those 2,000 people. I mean, is there research on that?
Yeah, so I think Bernie is much more in a position to answer these questions, but I'll just quickly comment, which is back to that point I made earlier in the talk when I was going through the challenges of data. And again, well, it's nice if we do studies on what people are doing on Facebook, but if we're doing those studies independent of information on what they do on their various email clients and what they do on their cell phones and what they do face-to-face, I think there are very serious limits to that. I mean, you could look at this is just anecdotally, and I'm sure most people in the room can relate. You could try to figure out my social network from what I do online, but I don't communicate with some of my best and closest friends on that network because they just happen not to be on it. And so if you're going to make conclusions about my life based on what I do on Facebook, it's going to be a pretty bad conclusion. And I suspect this generalizes to a lot of people. So I think there's serious limits for the reasons that I listed earlier on relying on just those within site data for making comments about, how digital media reflect our networks.
If you looked at an 11-year-old, though, you might think, or a 12-year-old. I mean, you might think differently, just because actually they're all on it.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's partly they're on it versus what medium did you decide? I mean, with my closest friends, I pick up the phone, and that's not reflected on Facebook per se. I mean, it's not. Period. Right? Unless
no,
you got.
I totally
mean,
agree with you. I'm just saying it does depend a bit who you're looking at.
Right.
Some, for kids or early teenagers for whom it's difficult to phone because they can't get credit, and
But again, even there, are they just on Facebook, or might they also be on Webkins and MySpace? And again, if it's a study of just one site, you're missing all the others. And who are they chatting with completely off these systems? I don't know. And then the other question is, it age or cohort? Like, once they are 15, like, is it because, I mean, is it going to apply that you could just look at that one site for them, or is it by 15 you really do need to? So I mean, those are questions I think are still up in the air, and we're not sure about. But thanks. These were some really great comments and questions. I very much enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.